or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Today we have an exciting webinar from Kevin here, which I'll introduce a little bit later. It's on a new type of refracs that we're going to call hybrid refracs in this webinar at least. Just a couple of logistical items before we get started today. We have more than 100 registered participants in the webinar today, so obviously we can't allow everybody to also speak at the same time. So everybody's muted by default, but that does not mean that you can't ask questions if you have any as we go through the webinar. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A chat box to the lower right. Webinar is going to be a total with Q&A 45 to 60 minutes. We got to try to be done before the next hour. And remember, we are recording, so this will be made available to all of you just after the webinar today. The webinar is facilitated by Whitson, and we're a company that's super excited about everything petroleum engineering. We have several software products that's dealing with everything in this kind of domain. We offer associated courses related to that, but also on the outside of that, if you're more into in-depth theory on different topics related to, for instance, gas EOR, gas condensate reservoirs, etc. The webinars that you're a part of right now, you can actually access all of the historical webinars on this link right here. Just go to our webpage, whitson.com/training. You can find a link to all the historical webinars, and you can also see what webinars are coming in the near future and register for those as well. If you are very excited about topics like this, you can come and join WhitCon 2023. That's our yearly conference for everybody that's interested in topics such as these. It's in Houston. We have it here every year. Last year it was in October. This year it's going to be Thursday, 19th of September. So if you're interested in learning more about that, just send me an email and we'll get to it. So over to the speaker. I'm very happy to have one of my friends, Kevin, here today. He's a senior completions engineer with BKV, but he also has previous experience with companies such as BP, BPX, and Hillcorp. He holds a Master in Science degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he, for those who've been in the technical community, you know that he is very active there. Various things with SBE, presented papers also there last year, and is actually now the committee chair for the SBE refractoring workshop for those that are interested in that. But most importantly, for me, he's a great guy. If you have ever met him at the conference, he's very approachable, and also call it geeky, Kevin, like myself. Which I love, like talking about these things. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and let you take over the floor.
Hey, thank you so much for the great introduction. Really appreciate it. And, we'll dive on into the presentation. All right, I think the screen share should be up and.
Yep, perfect.
No, perfect. Okay, so I'm Kevin Eichinger. I'm a senior completions engineer with BKV. If you're interested in how to get more production out of your refracs with less cost and less risk, come to the right talk. Today we're going to be talking about the hybrid expandable liner system. So we'll start off with talking about BKV's Refrac program, do an overview of that, who we are, and just a brief introduction to our program. Then we'll talk about pros versus cons of both bullheads and liner refracs and some of the differences between them. Next up, we'll introduce the hybrid expandable liner system. We will cover both the concept of it and the application of the first well that was used on. Followed by that, we'll look at the production performance from that well. This will be a comparison to both field-wide and regional offsets. And after that, we're going to look at some gas tracer analysis. This will be used to see what portion of that production performance is attributable to this hybrid system. We'll wrap up with some conclusions. So BKV entered the Barnett Shale with purchases from both Devon and XTO. What's really interesting here is there's wells like this CW Slay 1. It wasn't the first refrac, it wasn't the first slick water refrac, but this was a refrac that got a ton of publicity that helped to kick off the shale revolution. And had a couple of few fracs on it before, but what's really interesting is, and where this is going is those early wells that had these super vintage completions that BKV got originally from Devon and then also from XTO as well have, like 200 foot, 500 foot, sometimes even more cluster spacing, right? So depending on the basin you're in, a lot of the times, 20 foot and such is more common now. So really prime pickings for refrac candidates. There's a lot of different criteria to look at. Cluster spacing is obviously a big one, but what this means is it's like, man, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit for refracs. BKV didn't waste any time kicking off a very aggressive, excellent refrac program. Got several different job types. In the first 28 months of our program, we actually executed 369 refracs. So for that roughly 2-year period, we were the most active refrac operator in the nation, I believe, probably the world. At its peak, this was 5 frac crews. If you count a 24-hour crew as 2 12-hour, or if you count a 24-hour fleet as 2 12-hour crews, it's really an 8 12-hour crew equivalent at the peak of our activity. If you look at the plot on the lower left of this slide, what's really interesting about this is as we went from kind of doing some trials to just full-on execution of our refrac program, we were able to fully arrest and flatten full basin decline from refracs and workovers only, and that's before we ever kicked off our drilling program. So pretty cool result there. A lot of people in the past have kind of viewed the Barnett as like, hey, this is an old field, it's declining end of life, and we're actually able to completely flatten decline just with refrac before ever kicking off the drilling program. And I'm here today to say, the Barnett is alive and well. On the lower right, what you'll see is just a really generic wellbore diagram that kind of lays out some options that we've got for refracturing. I'm just going to cover this briefly, but we've got this seam called the upper Barnett that, across job types, we can typically add this seam as an extra stage. The heel pay is that pay that's above the existing top perforation that's still in the lower Barnett that, nobody ever attacked the first time. So commonly there's some pay that we can add there, and we can add that independent of the system or way that we refract the rest of the well. The focus of this presentation and the methodology and options we have is really going to be on what's labeled as the original lateral here. What that is it's the distance between the original perforations, right? We can tighten cluster spacing in there depending on the system we use or don't. We can, break that up into stages or not. But the focus here is really on that original lateral. With the rest of the well, you can think of it as, hey, we're going to attack that portion the same independent of what options we use. So for each individual well that we address, every well is unique. We want to select the optimum system for it and way to refracture it. So we're going to go through some of those options next. A very common one for us at BKV is bullheads. What a bullhead is it's where you take the entire lateral, the full lateral of that well, and you pump it as a single stage. You'll add, frequently you'll add perforation clusters in between the existing ones to tighten your cluster spacing. But at its core, what a bullhead is you're then going to treat that full well as a single stage. Jerry Brady in 2017 had a paper. He showed that these do add significant reserves. That's definitely been BKV's experience as well, with significant bookable reserves and uplift from these. And because they're single stage, you're not doing waterline. The frac is relatively quick. You're not installing a bunch of pipe or cementing or doing all these other operations. All of these lead them to be very inexpensive, which means they're very capital efficient. Things like F&D, IRR, time to payback, bullheads perform extremely well with. And once again, this is somewhat of a field dependent thing. I wouldn't suggest necessarily a bullhead for every field, but in the Barnett, we've had extremely good success with them. And before we move on, on the flip side of the pros versus cons to some of the other considerations, we do need to say that for shorter wells, they actually do a pretty good job of treating the full lateral. Now, On the flip side, there's some considerations we need to have. As lateral length gets longer, it gets more and more difficult to treat the full lateral with a single stage. So Dick Leonard had a paper looking at a whole bunch of RA tracer data and came to the conclusion that beyond about 2,300 feet, bullheads really begin to struggle. I've also looked at a lot of RA tracer data, some microseismic data, things like that, and come to pretty similar conclusions, reaching kind of a slightly smaller number than he did, but really all around that same ballpark where I'd say, the findings are pretty consistent. So what do you do, right? As wells get longer, if bullheads get less effective at being able to treat that full lateral, one of the most common mitigations is when we're going in there to tighten up cluster spacing and add new clusters, we will add less new clusters than we otherwise would want to. And that's an effort to, with less entry points, have a little bit more opportunity to effectively try and push that frac more to the end of the well, or to have better cluster efficiency, as opposed to, maybe a heel side bias or the one zone that's easier to break down if it's not all landed in the same target. So what does that do, right? You're creating less clusters, but you get better coverage of the full lateral length. Well, ATIA did some downhole temperature surveys, did a study where basically, they, after pumping fluid, they'd look for the cold peaks and found really large kind of warm troughs between those cool peaks. And what that said was, hey, when we're using this mitigation to try to, extend the lateral coverage, you're leaving pretty large gaps between those clusters that you're probably not, getting adequate frac coverage in those. So it's a mitigation, but then there's the downside that really by using this mitigation, you don't get to tighten cluster spacing as much as you'd like to, right? So which way do you want to go there? So where I want to draw your attention now is this table that's at the bottom of the slide. This is the core of this slide. And what we've got in the left side column is different buckets by lateral length. This is the length between the original clusters in the wells before we had any of the heel pay. 1,500, 200, 2,000, up all in 500-foot increments, all the way up to 3,000-foot buckets of well groupings, right? In that middle column where you see the well count, the only takeaway there is that these numbers are high enough that they're, I think, reasonably statistically significant, where we can, data's always got some variation, but I think we should somewhat be able to trust these, in terms of what we typically see in, doing data studies in different wells. These are reasonably statistically significant. We've got the average length within the bucket, not a big deal there, but the core where I really want to concentrate now is that right side column that says normalized incremental IP30. So the incremental IP30 is the metric that we like to use to assess performance. It gives us a nice quick answer. It doesn't change through time, and you're able to make decisions quickly without revising those again later. And what this normalized means is that if you see a 1 there, that would mean that this bucket performed at the average of the full data set across all buckets, across all wells. So your intuition might be, okay, with a longer well, we're going after a larger reservoir, might be more remaining there, and we'd expect, or at least hope, that with a longer well, we would get more production performance, right? But this is exactly what we do not see. In fact, all of these numbers across all the buckets really center pretty well around 1. In fact, at a minimum, we can probably say there's no correlation here. We don't see longer wells with higher production performance. In fact, if you really wanted to try to say there was a correlation, you might even say it's a negative correlation where the longer wells get worse performance. So what this tells us is that as well length increases, on average, we're probably leaving a little bit of reserves in the ground by doing a bullhead. Now, that doesn't make it the wrong answer. It still might be inexpensive enough that you get the best NPV or best F&D by doing this, but it's a decision that needs to be carefully weighed. And for every well, like I said, it's a unique decision. So what are some of our other options? Well, a very common one for industry is run a liner. There's several different types of liners available. Of course, I think the most popular one in industry is you have a cemented liner where you drop off pipe and then cement the full lateral. There's expandable liners that get you a larger ID, a little bit more expensive. All of these basically allow you to do plug and perf. I think, there's some ball drop options that I don't think anybody's really using anymore. But a variety of different options, including things like people try to run gel to block off a whole lateral and then come back and plug and perf. By the way, if anybody's been able to do that successfully, I'm definitely interested. Please, find me on LinkedIn, and I want to hear your story. At their heart, what a liner is it gets you the pressure control, the mechanical isolation to be able to break that frac into unique stages. Because we're having separate pumping events, we can now add more clusters, but specifically we can add more clusters without the risk of our cluster efficiency dropping off, right? So what this means is we're creating more unique fractures. With more fractures, we have more SRV, more EUR. At the end of the day, we just get better production performance because we're creating more fractures by breaking this into stages. Like I said, lots of different options for how to do this. In general, I don't want to get into too much into the specifics of unique systems, but all these are going to add very significant cost. You have metal, you have cement, you have operations to clean out and prep prior. You have operational risks in doing so, maybe a partially cemented lateral or incomplete returns or stuck equipment like things. One of the other big factors that I think kind of gets glossed over sometimes is the ID reduction, right? So when we have a reduced ID, it's not just a one-time thing. This actually rears its head at just about every point in the operation. That reduced ID means we're fracking through a reduced ID. That means higher friction pressures, higher treating pressure. That might turn out to be a higher frac invoice when it's time to clean out that well. We're now cleaning out the well through a reduced ID with smaller equipment. When it's time to produce, we have higher flow losses of the production through that reduced ID. And then not only that, but we've got this decision to make. Let's say you bring your liner top up to 30 degrees or so. Okay, do you want to use a smaller production tubing string to land your end of tubing inside of that liner where you'd really like it? Or do you want to raise your end of tubing higher than you want it? So now you've got that decision to make. So the ID reduction that comes from liners is a big factor for several points of a refrac operation as well. Bob Barbet, great guy, love talking to him. He had an interesting kind of unique solution. His take on this solution was take an expandable liner system, take expandable to mean you can get a somewhat larger ID and run that all the way to the end of the well. That's going to be really expensive with an expandable. Now, as a mitigation on the cost, he said, okay, now use extreme limited entry perforating. And then what that'll allow you to do is expand your stage length so that you have fewer stages. A little less perforating cost, less wireline stages, less waiting for your frac crew during those wirelines. So, it cuts back on cost a little bit, but at the end of the day, you're still going to end up with a really expensive refrac. So, what are some other options to address this, right? Sometimes a bullhead's a great solution, sometimes a full liner is there anything else that kind of can bridge that gap or be an optimum for some of these wells? So enter BKV's innovation, the hybrid expandable liner system. Like I said, first we're going to talk about the concept, then the application to our first well with it. So at its core, what a hybrid is this just simply a combination of both a bullhead and a liner refrac? And the goal here is to take as many of the advantages as we can of both while minimizing the downsides. What this means is that the bullhead is done out the toe of the liner as a single stage TCP, perforate ahead of time with TCP, set your liner, you bullhead out the toe, and then in the line portion, you can do plug and perforation and get extra stages, get additional create additional fractures with tighter perforations, right? More stages. So specific to this system, it's a hybrid expandable. The expandable means that we use a patch style system, which creates a large ID. One of the benefits of this large ID is that there's actually dissolvable plugs where because the idea of that expandable is so close to the idea of the base casing, this allows us to run a plug all the way through the expandable and set it in the base casing. So in that large gap between the end of the liner and that first perforation, we can actually break even that section into additional stages because we can set a plug in there because those IDs are close. Another benefit with the expandable is that you don't need to raise the liner top up. There's none of this, hey, set it in tension, compression kind of stuff. You can set that liner top horizontally. So now it's no longer getting in the way of your production tubing, either the diameter or the landing depth that you want to set that at. So onto the application of the first well, you see the schematic in the lower right. Maybe your eyes were already drawn there. The numbers at the bottom of that wellbore diagram that you see with the gray boxes were the original perforation clusters in that well. You see 5 of them. The numbers at the top of that well path are the newly added clusters as part of the refrac, and you'll see a couple of different colors that represent the different stages. We'll get into that more later. But between the clusters 3 and 5, the deepest ones on the toe side, that's a 1,300-foot bullhead stage. Between clusters 1 and 3, that's a 2,000-foot section over which we were able to add 8 plug-in perforation stages. So these are the stages that we were able to add these because of the hybrid system. And then above that shallowest prior existing cluster is the heel stage, and we were able to add the upper on this. Like I said before, the heel and the upper are stages that we would execute in the same way, independent of the system we selected. So in general, you can say we added 8 more stages than we would have done if this were a bullhead, and 36 more clusters than we would have done if this were a bullhead, creating a significant number of additional fractures. The really cool part about this, if you look at that light green highlight where it says 2 short patches, all we did was we ran 2 separate, very short patches over those heel side 2 clusters. That got us pressure isolation all the way up to that 3rd cluster to plug and perf over that section. And if you add the length of those 2 very short patches, it's only 8% of the length that we would have had to run a full liner up to 30 degrees inclination. 8% of the well being lined got us those 8 additional stages. So a really large lever to be able to get a lot without having to spend a lot there. So kind of a cool concept. Next up, you might be wondering how, hey, this looks nice, but how did it actually perform? So we'll get into that next. What we have here is a comparison of the production performance of the hybrid expandable liner system to both field-wide and regional offsets. You'll see that there's a bar chart on the right. At the top of that bar chart, the green bar that says 100% is the hybrid expandable liner system. And it says 100% because everything on this chart is normalized to that result on an incremental IP30 basis. So the next 4 in those blue bars, you'll see the comparison to the field-wide jobs. The first 2 being the field-wide liner average and median for liner wells. And then after that, the bullhead average and median. So intuition might tell you, hey, we've got this well that's kind of a mix between a liner and a bullhead. We should probably expect the production performance to be in between the liners and bullheads, right? And I would have been happy with that. I kind of would have expected that, right? But that's not what you see. What you see is that this hybrid system actually outperformed not just the bullheads, but actually the production performance on the field-wide average of the fully lined wells. Huh, that's interesting. How did that happen? Well, if I were you, the next thing I'd probably be thinking, okay, but these guys, they probably cherry picked. They just did this in the best kind of sweet spot of their field, so that it would turn out well. Is that what's going on here? So next we've got the regional offsets. These are the nearest jobs that were within about a 1-mile radius of this job. And what we see is that there were 2 liner jobs and 2 bullhead jobs within that roughly 1-mile radius. The regional jobs actually underperformed the field-wide jobs. So the regional liners, we see 83%, underperformed the field-wide liners, 97%, and the regional bullheads, that's the 44% average, underperformed the Bullheads. So if anything, we'd actually expect this job, based on where we put it, to underperform the field-wide average, not overperformed. But despite that, it outperformed the production performance field-wide of even the fully lined wells used to be in this partially lined system where we only had to line 8% of the well. Okay, still single data point, single well. Did we just get lucky? Did we hit a natural fracture? You know, what's going on here? Can we really attribute this to being because of this hybrid system? So that's what we'll look at next. What we have here is chemical gas tracer analysis that was done. And on the left side, what we've got is basically we took a unique gas tracer for every unique stage in the well. And on the left side plot, you see the wellhead gas production through time. And every different color is, you know, one individual different stage, how it performed through time. So we'll walk through that. At the bottom in the blue, you'll see the upper Barnett and the heel stage. These are the two stages that, like we said before, would have been done exactly the same way, independent of the system. It's above top perf. Whether you isolate the rest of it, you can do it the exact same way either way. The 8 stages above that in the various shades of green, these are the 8 plug-in perforation stages. These are the ones that specifically were enabled. You know, we were able to accomplish these because of running this hybrid system. And then in the gray at the top, you see the production performance from the Bullhead stage. So now we're going to take a move over to the right side, where instead of viewing wellhead gas production rate, we turn this into a cumulative plot through time. And we also take that gray Bullhead stage and rest it directly in the graph on top of the heel and the upper Barnett blue stages. You'll see why in a second. But the first thing that we'll notice, that thin gray sliver from the Bullhead, it actually underperforms not just the average, but every individual plug-in perforation stage. In fact, the plug-in perforation stages on average had 232% of the production performance of the Bullhead stage. Now, this is really interesting because that Bullhead stage was actually 5 times as long as the plug-in perforation stages. So that really exacerbates the production performance on a per foot of pay basis. How it calculates out is on a per foot of pay basis, the plug-in perforation stages actually performed 11.8, just call it 12 times as well as the Bullhead stage. Oh my gosh, right? Now what we do next, this part is really the focus of this whole slide. We need to do some mental math here. And basically what we're going to do is construct, you know, we call it a counterfactual analysis. What that means is this is an analysis on a case that did not happen, but we're trying to construct a what would have happened in an alternate scenario situation. So how we do this is, remember a couple of slides ago where we said Bullhead performance does not scale with lateral length. What follows from this is that if we would have taken that Bullhead, that 1,300-foot Bullhead stage, and expanded that to cover the full lateral, the production performance from the Bullhead would not have improved. So what follows from that is that the production performance from the full well, if we had done this as a Bullhead, effectively becomes the contribution from the Bullhead as is, that gray plus the heel and the upper Barnett that we would have done the same either way, meaning the estimated full well performance, if this well was done as a Bullhead, becomes that red dashed line. Now, if you compare this to the actual full well performance of the hybrid system, the green line at the top, what you'll notice is that the production performance is 2.9 times as good as our counterfactual analysis, what it would have done as Bullhead. Just say it performed 3 times as well as it would have otherwise. As a Bullhead, this well would have underperformed not just the field wide, but even the regional average of Bullheads. As a hybrid expandable liner system, this well outperformed the field-wide production performance on an IP30 basis um, of even fully lined wells. Once again, lining only 8% of the well to cover those two shallowest existing clusters with patches. So, in summary here, we basically use this tracer analysis to say, hey, we believe that the production performance is attributable to the hybrid expandable liner system. So in conclusion, this hybrid liner is basically a new tool that we've got in our toolkit at BKV that we can use on a situation by situation basis for doing our refracs. In addition to that, as we're scanning through thousands of wells and high grading these for refracs, what this can do is more highly prioritize wells that otherwise would have struggled with a bullhead. So if you've got a well with a longer lateral, but that would have struggled with a bullhead, but still wide cluster spacing that's interesting, this can be used to take what those candidates that might have otherwise struggled and now more highly prioritize them as refrac candidates. We know that the production performance compared to field-wide and regional offsets was good. It is a partially lined system that competes with actually fully lined wells. And then we used gas chemical tracer and kind of a counterfactual analysis to synthesize and say that this production performance, we believe, is actually attributable to this system. In closing, we'll say that the hybrid, it's like a favorable balance. What you get is great production performance that's really liner-like performance, but at a fraction of the cost. And you get this without excessive cost, you get this without excessive risk, and you get this without excessive ID restrictions that come from traditional liner systems. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you for your time. I'd like to thank my leadership at BKV, not just for trusting us to experiment, but also allowing us to share with industry and kind of work together so that we can get better together as an industry. I've got excellent teammates and we've got an exceptional field team that's able to execute safely and efficiently. And at this time, I'd like to open it up to any questions that you guys may have. I also need to preempt this with BKV recently submitted an S1 document to the SEC. What this means is that BKV is able, we're a private company, we're able to go public. Nobody knows if that will happen. Nobody knows when that will happen. But what that does is it puts us in something called a quiet period where I do need to limit the kind of questions that I can answer where it can't be anything, reserves based. It can't be anything dollars based, that I haven't talked about on this presentation in the past. What we need to do is really just focus on just the technical aspects alone. So thank you very much for your time. And if you guys have any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kevin. This is super interesting. We had like a basic question actually, just to fire things off. Maybe that's a low ball for you, but just the liner OD of these wells. Maybe you mentioned it, but just to iterate that for the audience, that'll be awesome.
Yeah, so there's actually two different wall thicknesses that we use. There's kind of a higher and lower pressure difference. Actually, the one we use, both of them would be fitting. More depends on what supply availability we have. So we're running these inside a 5.5 casing. I'd have to look at the document to pull up the exact ID of each of the two different options, but gosh, it's over a 4-inch. It's pretty big. It's right around there.
Oh. And then every time you're doing something that's kind of been as successful as this, going forward, are there like some of these, are the some main obstacles that you're always, like, from the learnings of what you've done, that you're always trying to prep operationally for before you start to do the next wells, for instance, that you've analyzed and identified as a good option?
Sure. I mean, the considerations for this, I don't think would be a whole lot different than the considerations for other wells. You might run a patch for, say, like if you've got a damaged casing or something. Basically what you want to do is you want to make sure you've got a really good clean out because you're running something with a larger diameter to make sure that nothing gets stuck up. The caveat on that I'd say is, this is something where you're doing it twice. And you also don't want to run a lot more patch than you need to. So you do some pressure testing to, make sure that you know exactly where your perforations are ahead of time, right? Maybe run an extra joint or two of patch versus what you think you need just to make really sure that you've got it covered. But, get a good clean out. And then other than that, I'd say, the considerations really aren't too much different from other patch jobs that are done for other purposes.
Yeah, awesome. There's also a question related to this. So since we saw that the lateral length had almost a negative correlation to the Bullhead Refracs, that is that the deeper stages and the longer laterals completely inefficient. In the hybrid Refracs, why did you choose to Bullhead the toe stage versus the heel stage? Could you interchange the lateral sections you choose to plug and perf and Bullhead?
Sure. So we would not have the option to swap those around. What we're able to do the plug and perforation on is basically what we're able to pump down with wire line. So as soon as there's an open perforation, you can get fluid flow into that perforation where your gun stops moving when you're pumping it down, as opposed to, being able to pump it down. So basically, we need all the perforations sealed off to be able to pump down to that past spot, to the deepest spot, right? Once we get to an open cluster, the gun might stop, right? So we'll TCP that first stage ahead of time. And then, basically with those patches, we block off 2 clusters. That gets us effective coverage all the way up to that third cluster. And then we can plug and perforate that section by doing pump down. Now, a natural question, one that I have in my mind is, okay, well, why not just, do something where we, use like a tractor and things like that. You get into issues around, duning with sand. Can your tractor actually get past this? What kind of issues do you run into if you need to rig down a frac fleet, do a clean out, stuff like this. So we try to not run tractors, due to some of those kind of concerns. But, at its core, I'd just say you want all of your clusters blocked off so that you can pump down. And then the deepest that you can pump down, aka your first cluster, defines the period shallower from which you can do your plug-in perforations, and then really control your frac design however you want to, and your perforating design however you want to.
One question related to, and again, maybe you mentioned this, but it was a question here that I think is very healthy to reiterate on. It's whether these wells were cemented liners or swell packer liners, or maybe a mix, or if you can elaborate on that.
Sure. So the base casing on these is just 5.5 casing, right? And then the liner system, it's neither of those. Basically, you've got a metal pipe, you run it in, and it's expandable. What that means is that there's a mandrel that comes inside of that pipe, and there's a couple of different options. One where you're basically mechanically pulling, the other one where you use pressure. Our preferred one over time has really become the one where you use pressure, and then that pressure acts on that mandrel to basically extrude it and expand that casing to press up against the outer casing diameter. And then there's seals at the top and bottom of the system. So the full inner metal string expands. But yes, there are other options for liner systems, right? Like, there's a swellable packer system that you can use. Cementable is a common option as well across industry. So, but this one's a unique one that's different from those.
Awesome. Another comment here was that a good number of wells in the Barnett were developed with sleeves/ball drop systems. Do you believe this can be done as well for refracs?
You could perforate your full well with TCP ahead of time and then open it up with a sleeve. You'd have pretty high rates going out of that sleeve. And then, the cost for TCP guns is going to be higher than the cost for, or, I mean, maybe this is unique to individual vendor pricing, but what everybody is able to get. But the cost for TCP alone is probably going to be more than the cost for wireline. And then if you add the cost of the ball and sleeve system on top of that, my expectation would be that it would be more expensive. And then you might get a slight friction difference on where it's going as well. So I don't think it would be my preference to go to a ball and sleeve system, but hey, if somebody's got a good argument for that, I'm always open to hearing it, right? So
And just looking a little bit broader, you've had experience from other companies and other basins in the past. One question that come in here is related to if you know what's unique with the Barnett, or is that just like, okay, BQE is there, so we're limited with that, or is there something unique with that basin that you know, maybe the age of the completion, all the things like this that you don't really find that much in other basins, or do you think that this can be, you know, as successful in other basins as well?
There's this is almost like opening up Pandora's box. There's a lot of unique things about the Barnett, right? There's a lot of unique things about a whole bunch of different basins, but the Barnett I think is really unique. The way that our fractures grow when you look at microseismic, they spread out a lot more. There's a lot more complexity, right? You know, there's some of these you know, a lot of other shale basins, you'll get these, you know, something that's a lot more like a single planar kind of a frac that'll beeline to the well right next to it, right? So that rears its head, that difference in a couple of ways, right? In other basins, you might have to tighten cluster spacing a little bit more than would be the optimum in the Barnett because you don't get the same fracture complexity, right? You'll also, because you know, your pressure in your frac is so strongly oriented in a lot of other basins, you know, other basins people get more negative FDIs where, you know, fracture driven interactions, you know, they used to be referred to, you know, as frac hits. Now they're referred more agnostically to whether they're positive or negative as fracture driven interactions. In the Barnett, these are overwhelmingly positive, right? So, you know, don't get me wrong, the negative ones do happen, you know, but on a like a percentage positive versus negative, you know, when I think about FDIs, it's like this is an exciting thing. I can frac this well and get uplift from the offsets. Now, we did do a study, you know, me and a couple of different teammates on, you know, how do we do some simple mitigations on FDIs to control the small number of them that are negative and make sure that we minimize the number of those? It was extremely successful. I think we eliminated 90% of the ones that were the worst of those that might require an offset clean out or, you know, extra work or things like that. Um, but you know, beyond that, the vast majority of them are very positive. In fact, there's a part on this graph uh, in a when this was presented at Your Tech, I had something in the appendix that we never got to, but it's worth mentioning nonetheless. You'll notice there's a spot in here where, you know, if you wanted to draw like a smooth decline on this, you'd almost be tempted to draw it through here like this. And it's like, well, what the heck happened in here, right? What happened is we actually brought online an offset vertical well. There were a couple of them. There's a different plot that actually has the stacked incremental from offsets that shows an even bigger overall system incremental from this project. And right on here, we brought on an offset that actually jumped way up where the system-wide offset netted a higher positive, but we see a very slight dip on this well here. So that's just to support the idea that, you know, one frac, you can actually get positives on several offsets as well. And it's, you know, that's something that, to answer your question, I think is very unique to the Barnett. You know, it's a lot more of a mixed bag, maybe even slightly tapered towards the negative connotation with FDIs there. But Barnett, it's like FDIs are something we get really excited about.
Awesome. Good. The last question will be for companies relate or that's you know, considering to do or start a refrac program in a basin where maybe it hasn't been done as much, or maybe the company hasn't been doing any refracs in the past. Do you have any kind of getting started recommendations that you know, from your hard learning, you know, a top 3 list or 5 list or whatnot?
Okay. Gosh, there's a lot. I'd encourage people to go big. You know, I think there's a lot of people that kind of dabble in refrac, right? There's early vintage completions across a lot of different basins. I think Eagleford has had huge success with it. Permian is just starting to dabble with it. I think there's a ton of potential in the Permian. Um, you know, when people do this, you know, sometimes you know, you'll see companies doing, you know, 4 or 5 kind of refracs. How do you get statistical significance doing that? How do you adjust from your lessons learned, right? The other thing that I think people hesitate around, you know, really putting a huge amount of capital into refracs for is the ability to book them, right? Everybody looks at reserve reports and kind of bases company values on, what's our reserves, right? You're probably gonna need to show the guys looking at your reserves more than 10 of these to get them to be willing to book them, right? There's also some stuff around, having, the ratio of your cost of a new drill versus the refrac to be able to book them. But, you're going to want to go big, one, to have time to capture those lessons learned, two, to be able to make them bookable, right? So I'd encourage people to, treat this almost like you do with your new drill programs. Like, don't have this be like a 1 to 2% of your activity kind of a thing. Go big on it. It's worth doing. The other thing is, you know, there's so many different factors on what makes a good refrac. So from the get-go, you want to develop a database of all the different factors that define your wells, the perforating strategy, the water to gas ratio, the EURs, the percent cumes, different metrics that tie these together and can say, what do we think the remaining potential is? And you want to look at these holistically, right? You want to look at your tight curve areas, your hot spots, your spacing to offset wells, drainage areas. I mean, there's so many pieces, but what you want to do is get a huge database of all your data together, get a team together, right? So I host a meeting twice a week where, we'll look over all these together. I'll bring candidates to the team that are kind of high graded, and we'll look at all of them. We'll look at subsurface seismic data. We'll look at offset water risks. We'll look at all the different factors that we think can make a refrac good or bad. And with a reservoir engineer and a geologist and myself on the completion side, we'll screen through them and pick our favorite ones. So it needs to be a multidisciplinary team where you're doing this to really take a holistic view to get the best ones, but make sure you're not missing any risks either.
Awesome. I promised that was kind of the last question, but we have one more that I want to do because it's a good one from Matt here. So what's the thinking on a single bullhead toe stage versus using additional patches on existing perfs to get more plug and perf stages?
Yeah, great question. I mean, what this really is at its core is, becomes like, hey, where's that fine line of, how much do we want to spend to patch further down, with the extreme being just a fully lined well versus where do we cut out that bullhead, right? So that's where I'd go back to, we need to go back to the question of, hey, what's the right amount of bullhead where we think the bullhead can do a good job, right? So this comes really from a lot of just looking at RA data of how fracs have grown with different numbers of clusters open. And that's something that's really going to be unique to each individual basin, right? So on the surface, we'll think of this as a footage basis, right? Hey, here's how many feet you can bullhead. But we talk about in terms of feet, not because it's the right answer, but because it's the simple answer. But that doesn't make it right. Really the right answer is probably more related to, how many perforation clusters or perforations do you have open? What kind of friction do you have there? Sure, there's aspects that relate to the footage. You get flow losses from your frac that might drive more of a heel side bias and such. But I think the stronger thing than the footage is really going to be how many perforations do you have? How many are you trying to add? And then comparing that to, when we're looking at RA data and comparing it to your gamma ray, hey, we might think, okay, you're in the lower Barnett, it's all the lower Barnett, but there's these different kind of sub buckets of the Barnett. And a lot of the times what we'll see is where the RA signal shows up or doesn't, where the proppant's going or not, it'll tie to that gamma ray signal. So what that tells me is almost more important than even your perforating strategy is just the geology and the slight stress differences, right? So there's a lot of different factors on the perf count and the geology that I think even are a stronger factor than just this, hey, here's roughly how many feet you can bullhead. So it's going to be kind of a moving target. I'd say, these other footage things that we think about, view those as more of a rule of thumb or an approximation, not really an absolute. So
yeah. No, awesome. No, thanks again for this, Kevin. Hopefully, I'm or I'm almost 100% sure I'll see you at several of these technical conferences this year. And thanks for all the attendees. Again, the recording will be distributed after the presentation on LinkedIn and YouTube and over email as well. So with that, thank you again, Kevin, and to the audience. Have a good rest of your Wednesday.
Hey, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate the opportunity to discuss this together, and you guys have a great day.